Hi, this is the Sustainable Development Goals podcast. I'm Maddie.
And I'm Elizabeth.
Okay, today's episode is going to be about climate. So generally, this podcast is going to be about the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We've grouped 16 of those into categories with climate, equity, sustainability, and health. So as I said before, the one we're focusing on today is climate, and then the 17th one, which is partnerships for the goal, is going to be connected throughout. So we will be discussing the 17th goal in each episode. Anyway, so under climate, we have the SDGs, climate action, life below land, and life above water. So why don't we first get into climate action? So the UN defines climate action's main goal is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So you might be wondering, what is climate change's impact? So right now we have impacts of bleaching of coral reefs and generally die-off of coral reefs. We have sea level rise leading to lack of housing on the coast and bigger natural disasters. And then we have droughts, especially in more arid areas like in the US and the southwestern portion of the US, and generally in more arid portions of the globe, including Africa and other countries. So then we also have bigger natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires. All of these come from climate change, sort of leading to a greater extremes of temperatures and therefore more extreme natural disasters. So right now, the main cause of climate change is CO2 emissions from industrialization. And this is dating back to the 1700s. And CO2 emissions increased by 6% in 2021, which leads to the highest level ever that we're having in CO2 emissions. So it's only climbing from now. And along with this, right now, climate finance as a whole has less than $100 billion a year towards climate finance, and the UN's goal is $100 billion a year, and that is the bare minimum for climate finance. So obviously, not much has been happening with climate and climate action right now. Not many governments are taking steps to reduce climate change, but let's see what's been done so far. So we have the Paris Climate Accords, which were an agreement signed in 2017 that wanted to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius and wanted to be carbon neutral by 2050. That means no CO2 emissions. So to do this, countries submit an NDC, or a nationally determined contribution, which is sort of like a climate change action plan, every 5 years. This accord was signed by 193 parties. So that's 192 countries plus the EU. And currently, most of the NDCs are not strong enough to be carbon neutral by 2050, and greenhouse gas emissions would actually increase by about 14%. While this is still lower than they would increase if we didn't have any NDCs, this is still not enough to be carbon neutral by 2050. So a different climate pact, which is the Glasgow Climate Pact, asks all countries to strengthen their NDCs by 2030. Essentially, this climate pact is sort of adding on to the Paris Climate Accords to say, we need to make this, stronger. This needs to be, a greater contribution towards the environment. Along with this, the main thing that's probably going to be driving climate change action is probably economics and how zero carbon solutions are economically sustainable, which is the main reason why a lot of countries are not using stuff like wind power or solar power, because it's just not economically sustainable. But right now, zero carbon solutions are becoming competitive in the markets. There's been a reduction in prices of electric cars and other things like that. So zero carbon solutions and solutions that are climately sustainable are becoming more competitive and are becoming more widespread in the markets. So let's move on to our next goal about climate in general, which is life below water. So this main goal is mainly about conserving and sustainably using the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Right now, our marine ecosystem is currently very damaged. You might know the most probably common and well-known thought of it being damaged is the amount of plastic pollution we currently have. About 17 million metric tons of pollution entered the ocean in 2021, and that's only increasing. We also have a lot of overfishing. So we have a lot of large-scale fishing companies causing loss of jobs and income for smaller fisheries, which is definitely not good. And then the pandemic has exacerbated impact on smaller fishing communities. Basically, these fishing communities are not able to support their livelihood, which is leading to more overfishing by these big fishing companies. We also have the acidification of the ocean. This comes from the ocean's ability to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and turn it into carbonic acid. This is leading to a rise in acidity in the oceans, which is not good because that leads to a disruption of ecosystems through like coral and plants and other sort of underwater ecosystems, and generally even like a change of like 1 to like 0.1 to 1 like pH can like be massive impact on these small ocean communities. And along with this, acidification actually limits the ocean's capacity to moderate climate change, because eventually there will be a point when the ocean can no longer absorb as much carbon dioxide as it has been, which will lead to more carbon dioxide in the air, which leads to increasing temperatures. We also have eutrophication, which essentially means there are too many nutrients in the water right now. That might sound like a good thing, but it actually leads to these algae blooms that create dead spots in the water, where they sort of block off any light from reaching plants in the water that are underneath these algae blooms, and causes like death in these plants, which can release like more toxic chemicals into the ocean and lake and bay environments. So overall, we have like too many like nitrogens from like fertilizers like nitrates and nitrites, and also just like some like phosphates and stuff like that. We also generally have ocean warming, which comes from climate change in general. As the air heats up, obviously the ocean is going to heat up as well, albeit as a slower rate. But this ocean warming is also having a devastating impact on fish communities and plant communities. So what has been done so far to protect our oceans? So we have marine protected areas, which cover about 10% of all coastal areas, which, while not necessarily is better than obviously having 0%, is not necessarily super great right now. We also have improved overfishing regulations in the past couple of years that have led to higher fish stocks in areas that have been traditionally overfished, such as off of the coast of South America. We also have some communities introducing like traditional knowledges to improve lives and combat overfishing, sort of traditional ways of regulating the environment to make sure we don't overfish. So then our final SDG for climate is life on land. So let's talk about life on land. Life on land's main goal is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So that is a lot. But essentially for the first one of that, or second, like sustainably managed forests, about 10 million hectares of forests are destroyed each year for agriculture. This is mainly in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa. Certain governments in Latin America right now, like I know Brazil in particular, are sort of almost increasing deforestation in the Amazon for more agriculture and more economic development, but this is obviously not sustainable. However, we also see gains in forest in areas like North America, Europe, and Asia. However, these gains are not enough to combat the loss of these forests in Africa and Latin America. So right now we have about 40,000 species at risk of extinction from the lack of forests, and overall this is definitely not good. Lack of species leads to a lack of biodiversity. Along with this, essentially, protecting the ecosystem is important for future generations in order to make sure we have enough resources to sustain our growing population, and also just to make sure that more trees can help absorb CO2 and slow down climate change. And if we cut those down, we're obviously not helping climate change. So what's been done so far? Nearly half of all key biodiversity areas, otherwise known as KBAs, are under protection. However, growth of this coverage is slow, so not many places are continuing to be protected. And this lack of coverage mostly comes in Asia, so yeah. Countries are also beginning to add biodiversity values to natural accounting / reporting system, so making sure that when they're looking at their budgets, they're making sure to factor in money for biodiversity, and also making sure when setting up like goals for the country, they want to add biodiversity. We also have, most countries have national biodiversity targets. Like I said, most countries have a goal they want to reach in biodiversity targets. However, right now, the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of led to a slowdown in biodiversity recovery, mainly because it's been largely neglected in COVID recovery packages. It seems like COVID is the main issue right now.
Now here for our question portion. So Maddie, what are some caveats of pushing towards sustainable development?
So right now, in a lot of like developing countries, sustainable development isn't really a feasible solution. Like, it's not really what's focusing on right now, because obviously we've seen that sustainable development can be very expensive, and that's something that is sort of like being able to develop in a sustainable way is a privilege for like developed countries like Western Europe, like the USA, like because they have a lot of money and because they are typically at peace and have sort of a secure infrastructure, they can push for sustainable development, and all these areas have high GPAs. In developing countries, for places that have been sort of like war-torn for the past couple of years, have been affected by colonization and other like sort of global issues, then it's harder to push towards sustainable development because they're mainly just working on being secure right now. However, we're also seeing that like we need to push for climate action like now. Like, this is an issue that is fastly approaching its sort of turning point, and it's hard to sort of balance like making sure these smaller countries are being like sustainable and using their resources well and efficiently, but also making sure they're not like overspending beyond their reach.
There are also like metals that are used for like different sustainable things, like sustainable cars and batteries and solar panels, that are harder to find minerals and that are in itself, when mass produced, less sustainable.
Yeah.
So how can we support developing countries while still pushing for sustainable development?
Well, I would definitely say that some of our more developed countries, such as the USA and countries in Western Europe, can definitely help by like setting up trade deals, setting up like sort of donations to these younger countries that are sort of like still trying to find their way, to like sort of help them push for sustainable development or to like set up better infrastructure. I think the UN could also set up some certain like policies or motions to help like fund these smaller countries into sustainable like infrastructure and like different ways. But we also want to make sure that we're generally focusing on sustainable development as a whole. We don't want these developed countries to sort of like overtake these smaller countries in terms of like policy and things like that. Like, we want these countries to be autonomous, but we also want to give them support.
All right, so how can countries be better motivated to push for climate action initiatives?
Yeah, so I feel like that's a major problem right now, where the reason we don't have a lot of climate action initiatives is because like many countries don't feel like they like want to do any like climate action initiative. Is just like not their main priority right now. I would say it's definitely helpful. Like, I feel like a lot of countries are starting to sort of like push towards climate action, but I think like better like more like motivation from people and like more like public opinion on climate action could definitely be helpful. Like rallies, protests, all of these things can help like push for climate action, sort of like say to like these countries like, hey, we need like climate. Just like in these countries with larger populations like China and India, it's definitely important to push for like more climate and like action initiatives, and definitely like working on like making sure to cut down on like carbon emissions in general.
One of the issues with like the larger countries is the fact that they so heavily rely on industry, like the US, China, so heavily rely on like factories, and those outputs definitely negatively affect the climate. Mm-hmm. And so those are some of our main CO2 emissions.
Yeah. So then,
relating back to the 17th Sustainable Development Goal, how can the U.S. in particular better partner with other countries in climate action?
I would definitely say that like the US definitely needs to step up in terms of climate action.
I
Like
agree.
I would say the Trump administration in particular did not do a good job of prioritizing climate action.
Didn't we remove ourselves from the Paris?
Yeah,
Paris
we
Climate
removed
Accord?
ourselves from the Paris Climate Act, which is definitely not good. I have to check, but I believe Biden.
I think we re-entered.
Yeah, I believe Biden rejoined that, but definitely the Biden administration needs to work on like prioritizing climate action because a lot of stuff that Biden has said he's going to do, he's not exactly done. So, like, we definitely like need to work on prioritizing climate action. I think the US in particular can be a great leader for the rest of the world in like climate action, and like here's how does like as a big country that has a lot of like industry, here's how we sustainably like make use of our resources, like more wind power, more solar power, like more hydropower. Like if we make hydropower and solar power a profitable industry, then other countries will want to follow that. Like the US is a leader in the world, so we need to like act like a leader.
I feel like also one of the first steps, like as a country, we should take is holding companies and corporations accountable for their actions, as well as making incentives for them to switch to more sustainable energy sources. Because if you make it for their benefit, they probably will, which will then overall help with CO2 emissions. So
I think a lot of like billionaires in particular can work on making the companies they own like more sustainable. Like you obviously have the money to make it more sustainable, so
it's just cheaper not to.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's like making like right now climate change is an ethical decision. We need to make it like an economic like decision to like go forth in climate action.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to episode 1 of the Sustainable Development Goals podcast. We'll be back next week with our next episode on equity. See you then. Bye.
Our sources were the United Nations, specifically the Sustainable Goals section, the Climate Action section, and the Sustainable Development Goals report. We also use the Glasgow Climate Pact. So thank you for listening.